The first thing that bothered me wasn't the depth or the pressure. It was the way my lights kept catching something that wasn't there a second earlier. I was hovering just above the trench wall, doing a routine sweep I'd done dozens of times before, when the shadows started behaving like they were late to something. I remember feeling stupid for being unsettled, because nothing in my instruments suggested danger, and my breathing was still steady. That's when I remembered there were 11 strange rules they make you agree to before dives like this. Rules nobody explains properly. I'd already broken one, and the water around me felt like it knew. I could still hear my own heartbeat in the suit as I remembered Rule 1. Never acknowledge a shadow that moves independently of your light source. The first time it happened, I was adjusting my tether and caught a flicker at the edge of my vision, a shape that didn't obey the beam from my lamp. My hands froze mid-motion, and I forced myself to focus straight ahead, convincing my brain that it was just a trick of the currents or sediment. But the water around me had changed subtly, denser somehow, like the shadow had shifted the pressure without moving physically. I tried to laugh quietly at myself, muttering, "It's nothing. It's just me seeing things," though every instinct screamed that I was wrong. I had to remember every detail of how the shadow moved, because it wasn't immediate. It lingered just out of focus, close enough that my suit seemed to weigh more on my shoulders. The sensation made me question if the beam was malfunctioning, or if my own mind was failing, but I knew that acknowledging it could be worse. There's a kind of self-deception that comes with isolation down here, where you try to rationalize what doesn't fit, and I found myself tracing the shapes with my eyes without really looking. Even when I reminded myself to ignore it, the corner of my vision felt alive, crawling along the trench wall with a deliberate slowness I couldn't name. Every move I made was calculated to avoid the shadow, yet my training forced me to keep scanning, every sweep of the lamp feeling like a violation of some invisible boundary. The trench floor itself seemed to respond to the presence of the shadow, tiny particles of sediment rising and falling as if the water had memory. I found myself calculating distances obsessively, tracing imaginary lines between my position and every dark patch on the rock, trying to keep them in a grid of safety. My gloves brushed against the metal of the survey marker, and I kept whispering reassurances to myself, repeating small instructions about light angles and tether adjustments. The shadow, if it could be called that, didn't shift rapidly. It paused, timed its movements with my own, which made ignoring it feel like a betrayal of some unspoken contract. At that moment, the weight of my awareness alone felt like a physical drag, pressing down on my chest through the suit, reminding me that I was not alone. Time became slippery. 1 second I was adjusting gauges, the next I realized that my computer had counted minutes that felt like hours, the numbers crawling in a way that made no sense. I debated moving away to see if distance made a difference, but the trench is a corridor that doesn't forgive deviation, and every turn of my head carried the risk of glancing at that movement. The shadows had a rhythm, almost patient, like they were waiting for a specific cue I couldn't perceive. I tried to focus on breathing, to compartmentalize, but the isolation amplified everything. The small noises, the water currents, the faint undulation of my tether. Each flicker of movement was exaggerated, and I realized that Rule 1 was not about what you saw. It was about what your mind chose to register. I started keeping a mental log, marking where I had seen the shift, and when, as though cataloging it would make it inert. But the shadows weren't static entities you could track. They adapted, like they were aware of my observation. My thoughts spiraled between logic and disbelief, questioning if my training had prepared me for a presence that obeyed physics only part of the time. I remembered one of the supervisors saying something about patience, that these depths are not forgiving to those who underestimate subtle changes. And yet, in the same breath, he had warned that Rule 1, never acknowledge a shadow that moves independently of your light source, wasn't a suggestion. The realization was both simple and horrifying. Seeing was not the danger. Acknowledgement, even passive, could be. I found myself imagining scenarios, every one a small moral compromise. Should I swing my light just a little more? Should I adjust my path slightly to avoid crossing it? Every potential action became a test I was already failing. The trench wall glistened unevenly under my beam, patterns forming and dissolving with the current, and the shadows seemed to mimic every subtle gesture. The more I tried to suppress acknowledgement, the more the presence pressed into my perception, until it felt like the trench itself was breathing with me. Each decision was tiny and meaningless, yet the consequences felt monumental. I realized I was balancing not only my physical body against pressure and currents, but my mental state against something patient and inscrutable. Eventually, I stopped pretending the movement didn't exist, and instead focused on the water itself. Currents, particulate flows, tiny eddies, anything to anchor me in measurable reality. The shadow lingered, always at the edge of my vision, but I ceased naming it in my thoughts. Thoughts became my weapon. Ignoring, observing, compartmentalizing. I ran through every drill I knew, every mental exercise to maintain focus. Still, the movement, the deliberate out-of-sync motion of the shadow, haunted each flicker of my instruments. And I understood that ignoring it didn't eliminate risk. It only delayed confrontation with whatever consequence would arrive if I acknowledged it. As I progressed along the survey path, the trench narrowed, and the shadows multiplied subtly, layering over each other in ways that defied logic. My beam caught the edge of a rock, then something behind it that shouldn't have been there, and my brain flinched before I could stop it. That flinch was a test of restraint, an internal trial, and I forced myself to keep moving. The more I adhered to Rule 1, the more the environment felt alive, responsive, like a living puzzle calibrated to my reactions. Every meter forward felt like a negotiation, each sweep of my light a potential misstep. I started timing my movements, aligning my breath with the sway of the tether, creating a rhythm that would minimize interaction with the unseen. By the time I reached the point where the survey marker twisted into a natural alcove, I realized I had spent hours measuring not just distance but reaction. Shadows, trench walls, my own suit. They were all part of an unspoken test. The deeper I went, the more acute the sensation that recognition, even subconscious, would be punished. My mind, already fraying, began fabricating responses to the slightest flicker. What if I turned my head too quickly? What if my light caught a reflective patch that mimicked movement? What if the shadow could sense hesitation? I had to remain calm, analytical, mechanical, while every instinct screamed to glance at the motion, to react. The trench felt infinite, though I knew I was in a confined space. And then I noticed the change. Subtle at first, almost imperceptible, the shadow paused, holding shape longer than it should. My heart contracted as I adjusted my lamp, just enough to verify that nothing had crossed my line of sight. I could feel the weight of something impossible to define, a presence not in space, but in awareness. I forced my body into slow, deliberate movements, tether in hand, reminding myself silently of Rule 1, the only verbal acknowledgement I allowed. It was no longer about avoiding physical danger. It was about preserving my mind, my sense of reality, and somehow surviving long enough to report the experience. Every meter forward felt like threading a needle between consciousness and something else, something patient and waiting. The trench walls shifted slightly under the beam, as if nudged by currents I could not measure, and the shadow reappeared, stretching along the alcove's edge. I clenched my jaw and forced my gaze away, telling myself that control was in focus, in ignoring, in every careful step. Even so, I knew my adherence to Rule 1 had a limit, and I could feel my thoughts fraying at the edges, as if acknowledging the possibility of recognition was already compromising my stability. Each breath became deliberate, each blink measured, each mental calculation a barrier against the subconscious slip that would end the experiment, or me. I could feel my fingers trembling on the handles of the submersible controls as I tried to remind myself of Rule 2. Always maintain visual contact with at least one fixed reference point at all times during a descent. It seemed simple on paper, a matter of keeping my bearings, but down here in the Mariana Trench, even a single misjudged glance could stretch into minutes of disorientation. I found a protruding rock formation to anchor my gaze, though it felt like the wall itself was shifting imperceptibly. subtly bending the space around me. My eyes flicked back to the instruments repeatedly, confirming my depth, my orientation, my artificial horizon, but every sweep of the lamp showed me more shadows that weren't supposed to be there. The shadows weren't fast. They slid along surfaces like predators moving with patience, testing the limits of my attention, and I realized that losing track of even a single reference point could allow them to creep closer than I could measure. As I pressed forward, I became aware that the fixed points I relied on weren't as stable as they seemed. Tiny fissures in the rock created misleading edges, and the trench walls themselves caught the light strangely, producing angles that could fool the eye. I repeated the rule over and over mentally, embedding it into every calculated movement, because any lapse could mean floating free in a space where nothing obeyed expectation. My hands clutched the stabilizing handles of the submersible, and I felt every vibration through the metal frame as if the trench were testing my grip. Maintaining visual contact wasn't just about safety. It became a psychological lifeline, something to tether my thoughts and prevent them from drifting into panic as the shadows danced near the edge of my lamp. Time itself warped around me, minutes melted into hours, each one measured in the rhythm of my blinking eyes and the slow mechanical adjustments of the submersible. My mind began to fabricate phantom reference points, as if the rule itself had morphed into a trap. I would lock onto a shadow or a glint and instinctively recognize it as a landmark. Each correction was exhausting, but essential, because letting my gaze slip even momentarily brought the eerie sensation of the trench closing in around me. The shadows mirrored this movement subtly, and I realized they had their own pattern, an understanding of when I faltered. My body stiffened every time I caught something moving in the periphery, and I repeated the steps drilled into me during training. Check instruments, adjust orientation, reaffirm my chosen reference point. By the time I reached a ridge that jutted into the trench's main column, I was acutely aware of every detail: the way the water refracted light, the tiny currents flowing against the hull, even the faint pulse of my own heartbeat through the suit. My reference point, a jagged rock edge, felt like it had become part of me, a tangible anchor in a liquid void. Yet I could sense more than see, the presence of multiple shadows shifting in patterns I couldn't predict. Each movement I made was deliberate, measured against the rule, and I realized that the rule was more than procedural. It was a survival framework that demanded constant vigilance and absolute trust in perception. I couldn't look away, couldn't allow the mind to wander, because the moment I lost the anchor in sight, the trench would claim that space. I tried to focus on breathing, deliberately counting each inhale and exhale, while my eyes darted between instruments and the rock formation I had designated as my visual tether. Every flicker of movement made me question if the reference point was truly stable, or if the shadows themselves had somehow bent it into something unrecognizable. My hands ached from gripping the controls so tightly, but releasing even slightly felt dangerous, a potential invitation for disorientation. I reminded myself again of Rule 2, whispering it internally to reinforce the mental commitment, because in this abyss, lapses of memory or attention were just as lethal as a mechanical failure. My pulse accelerated, not from exertion, but from the constant vigilance, and every glance felt like a test of endurance against an environment that didn't forgive mistakes. The shadows continued their silent approach, moving with the patience of predators who understood that my attention was fragmented. I found myself constantly recalibrating the lamp angles, adjusting the focal point of the beam to reinforce the anchor, yet it never felt secure. The trench seemed to respond to my awareness, shifting subtly as if acknowledging my observation. I noticed that maintaining the reference point wasn't just about avoiding physical danger anymore, it was about sustaining my mental state, keeping the creeping dread at bay. My thoughts wandered briefly, imagining scenarios in which losing visual contact meant immediate disorientation, floating endlessly without gravity or guidance, trapped in a void of uncertainty. By mid-descent, my physical exhaustion compounded the mental strain. Muscles ached from subtle continuous adjustments to counter currents, and every motion required coordination that felt increasingly impossible. The trench walls became more jagged, forcing me to choose reference points that were imperfect or unstable. Each choice felt like a compromise, a small gamble against unseen consequences. Shadows continued their slow slide, invisible yet palpable at the edge of perception, and I found myself timing every eye movement, every breath, to coincide with a rhythm I barely understood. My mind, half delirious, clung to the rule like a mantra, a tether against the abyss, threatening to erase familiarity and reason. I noticed a subtle shift in the shadows' behavior as I approached a narrow canyon within the trench. They seemed to mirror my adherence to the rule, hesitating when I held visual contact, moving when my gaze shifted even slightly. Panic hovered beneath consciousness, yet I forced calm, realizing that Rule 2 had transformed from simple instruction into the axis of my survival. Every meter forward was measured not just in physical distance, but in the precision of mental focus, the relentless observation of the anchor, and the discipline to ignore the increasingly insistent shapes creeping along the walls. I began to understand that the shadows weren't aggressive in the usual sense. Their threat was more insidious, a test of perception and endurance that could erode the mind silently. The submersible lights glinted against the trench walls, creating false angles and illusory forms, and I found myself repeatedly verifying that my reference point remained constant. I could feel fatigue pressing down, turning judgment sluggish, making my eyes deceive me more readily. Each small lapse sent waves of anxiety rippling through my consciousness, and I had to take a moment to reset, to reinforce the focus on the rock edge that had become my anchor. The shadows lingered at the periphery, testing limits, while my own body and mind began to argue over whether what I was seeing was real or manufactured by exhaustion. The trench offered no answers, only a continuous silent pressure demanding attention. As the descent continued, I noticed that my spatial awareness had narrowed to a tunnel of focus, everything outside the reference point receding into ambiguous shapes and darkness. Every decision, every tilt of the lamp, became a deliberate act to preserve alignment with the fixed marker. The shadows moved in ways that suggested intelligence, a rhythm calibrated to my behavior. I realized that the rule was not about safety in the physical sense, but maintaining coherence in a place that threatened to unravel the mind itself. My breathing slowed, my movements precise, and my attention so laser-focused that the world outside the anchor seemed to disappear entirely. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time had lost meaning, and I noticed subtle changes in the rock formation, slight differences in texture and angle. It was almost as if the trench itself were testing my perception, embedding tiny inconsistencies to see if I would lose focus. The shadows shifted in concert with these anomalies, yet I never lost visual contact, never allowed myself to be drawn away from the designated point. Exhaustion gnawed at my limbs and thoughts, but I clung to Rule 2, always maintain visual contact with at least one fixed reference point at all times during a descent, the single certainty in a fluid, uncertain world. By the time I reached a wider section of the trench, where multiple reference points were possible, but none as secure as my initial choice, I understood the true cost of the rule. Every choice had been deliberate, every blink, every adjustment, a negotiation between survival and mental collapse. The shadows, now more numerous, seemed patient, observing my discipline without overt movement, and I realized that the rule wasn't about avoiding harm in the conventional sense. It was about preserving coherence of perception against a deep, patient pressure that could erase understanding without warning. My eyes burned from the effort, my muscles ached from tension, yet I continued, moving meter by meter, mind tethered to that single, unshifting anchor. I remember the moment vividly, my gloved hand hovering inches from what looked like a pulsating mass embedded in a crevice, and thinking about Rule 3. Never attempt to touch or interact with anything that appears to be a biological entity until you have full confirmation of its nature. It seemed like an instinct to reach out, curiosity clawing at my brain, but training and the rule screamed restraint. The object wasn't moving in any way I could measure, yet it had an almost imperceptible undulation, a rhythm that felt oddly alive under my light. My fingers twitched involuntarily, and I whispered to myself that even a small interaction could trigger consequences I couldn't anticipate. The water around the crevice seemed to pulse subtly in response, as if the entity itself could sense intention, a silent acknowledgement that made my skin crawl inside the suit. I backed off slowly, letting my eyes trace the contours, searching for any clear signs of life that would justify intervention. Every movement of the submersible was cautious, deliberate, measured to avoid disturbing the surrounding particles or drawing the shadows closer. It was difficult to maintain calm. The combination of isolation, pressure, and the unknown amplified every second into a small eternity. My instruments confirmed no motion detectable by sonar, but that didn't matter. Rule 3 was about discipline, not proof, and ignoring it even momentarily could unravel hours of careful navigation and mental stability. I could feel the presence of other shapes lurking just beyond the beam, watching the way I hesitated, testing if I would break protocol. As I continued along the trench, I realized how much the rule was a psychological as well as physical safeguard. The Mariana Trench is littered with things that resemble life but aren't, or perhaps they are life in a form that doesn't register with normal senses. My mind began cataloging every anomaly, noting patterns in color, movement, and texture, a mental checklist to avoid missteps. The longer I followed the trench walls, the more I noticed the delicate balance of attention required. Glanced too quickly, and my perception skewed, creating phantom interactions where none existed. My gloved hand itched constantly, an urge to verify tangibly what my eyes already suggested. But I kept it firmly by my side, reminding myself that Rule 3 forbade even the slightest physical engagement without confirmation. Time bled together, minutes and hours indistinguishable, each one a test of restraint and focus. The trench walls seemed alive, not in movement but in suggestion, teasing with forms that flickered at the edge of recognition. I found myself studying an overhang that curved like a mouth or an eye, a formation that made me momentarily question whether the rule could apply to inanimate shapes. My brain wanted to rationalize, to say it was just geology, but instinct warned that any interaction, curious probing, accidental contact, could trigger outcomes beyond comprehension. I adjusted the light, leaned the submersible slightly, recalibrated my focus on the fixed reference point I had maintained since Rule 2, and continued. At one point, I noticed what appeared to be a faintly luminescent filament undulating near the trench floor, almost like a tendril or sensory appendage. The immediate reaction was to examine it, to see if it was biological or just debris reacting to the current. My training screamed at me to wait, to analyze through instruments before any physical action. I ran through mental simulations of what could happen if I ignored Rule 3, recalling stories of divers whose curiosity had led to inexplicable disappearances or long-term psychological effects. The filament moved as if it sensed me, curling in the water in rhythm with the shadows that had followed me since the beginning of the descent. My hands gripped the controls tighter, each adjustment deliberate, each breath counted, my heart thrumming like a metronome, keeping time with the trench itself. As I navigated further, I realized the rule had another layer, less obvious but more insidious. It wasn't just about touching unknown life forms. It was about resisting the compulsion to interpret them, to impose narrative on the unknowable. My mind wanted to label the filament, to define the shadowy entities as predators, prey, or background ecology, but Rule 3 demanded withholding judgment. Every tentative glance, every micro-adjustment of my lights, became a meditation in restraint. I could feel the trench pressing against me in response to attention. Every time I lingered on a formation, the water thickened slightly, currents shifting imperceptibly, as if the environment itself measured my curiosity. The psychological toll was immediate. Hours of tension, combined with isolation and near-constant vigilance, created a subtle gnawing fatigue that made me doubt my own senses. Was the filament moving on its own, or was my mind fabricating patterns? Were the shadows responding to me, or simply flowing with currents I couldn't detect? Each moment required careful compartmentalization. Observe without contact, analyze without interference, resist the urge to reach. My gloved hands twitched constantly, as if rebelling against the unbroken discipline imposed by Rule 3. I realized that the rule was more than a precaution. It was a psychological anchor, the only mechanism preventing total mental collapse in the face of incomprehensible isolation. Further down the trench, I encountered multiple formations that seemed to mimic each other, clusters of shapes that swayed in unison, almost deliberately avoiding the light beam yet always visible in peripheral vision. The compulsion to touch, prod, or interact rose with every inch I descended, a tangible itch that made the rule feel like a prison. But I forced myself to stay detached, documenting everything through instruments, carefully noting every movement, every slight change in shadow or form. The trench seemed to respond, subtle shifts in pressure against the hull, faint undulations in currents, a constant reminder that engagement, even accidental, might carry consequences I couldn't yet comprehend. I began running mental simulations of worst-case scenarios, touching a filament and triggering a chain reaction of movement in unseen entities, or worse, prompting the shadows to converge. Each simulation was a lesson in fear management, reinforcing the importance of Rule 3 while simultaneously exhausting me mentally. The shadows, ever present, never overtly threatening, but always insinuating, seemed to test my compliance, their slow dance pushing the boundaries of attention and patience. I realized that restraint was not just about survival, but maintaining coherence, preventing the trench from reshaping my perception into something I couldn't recover from. Hours blurred further, the lights of the submersible illuminating patches of the trench that seemed to shift slightly every time I looked away. I resisted the impulse to adjust position for a closer look, remembering the stories of divers who had failed this exact mental trial. Each decision became a negotiation between curiosity and compliance, desire and survival. My muscles ached from holding the submersible steady, my mind strained to maintain observational discipline, and my thoughts often drifted toward hypothetical scenarios of contact. Every movement was deliberate, a small victory against the persistent urge to violate Rule 3 and pay the unknown cost for human curiosity. By the time I reached the midpoint of the descent, the shadows and filament-like shapes had multiplied, forming a complex interplay of movement that was difficult to track. I clung to the rule mentally, embedding it as a shield against instinct, against the faint allure of interaction. I realized that the Mariana Trench demanded not just physical precision, but psychological endurance, and Rule 3 was the thread holding sanity together. Every decision was a test of patience, every glance a measure of self-control, and every measured breath became a tool to enforce the discipline that could prevent my complete disintegration into fear, isolation, and the unknowable dark. I could feel the tension coiling in my shoulders as I glanced at the depth gauge, thinking about Rule 4. Always track your ascent and descent rates meticulously, as even minor deviations can have irreversible consequences. Down here, the Mariana Trench didn't forgive imprecision, and I had learned that every inch mattered. The pressure alone could crush the submersible if I made a miscalculation, but worse than the metal, it could crush the mind too, leaving you aware but paralyzed. My hands hovered over the controls, fingers twitching, measuring throttle adjustments in milliseconds. Each minor change a potential life or death gamble. Even the smallest deviation created a ripple of anxiety, like a stone tossed into a pool that spreads infinitely, touching every nerve in my body with anticipation of disaster. As I moved deeper into the trench, I noticed how deceptive the perception of speed could be. The wall of darkness pressed close, and my instruments became the only reality I could trust. Every slight change in descent rate made me question whether I had misread the gauges, whether I had allowed fatigue to distort my judgment. The shadows lingered at the periphery, subtle and slow, almost imperceptible in their movement, and I realized that the rule wasn't just about numbers. It was about maintaining control in a space that encouraged mental drift. One misstep could cause the submersible to tilt, scrape a jagged rock, or accelerate into a pressure pocket, and the weight of responsibility pressed heavier with each passing minute. I started marking time intervals mentally, calculating rates against depth, adjusting for subtle currents that threatened to push the submersible off course. Every decision had to account for mechanical limits, human reflexes, and environmental anomalies. I noticed micro fluctuations in the water pressure against the hull, and each one demanded immediate correction. Maintaining these calculations under isolation, with shadows whispering just outside the light, tested more than skill. It tested patience and resolve. My mind, already frayed from the relentless focus required by previous rules, strained under the constant monitoring, a delicate balance between adherence and panic. The trench itself seemed alive in ways I hadn't anticipated. Currents shifted unpredictably, and even slight changes in ballast required instant correction. The shadows moved subtly with these shifts, almost synchronizing with the submersible's rhythm. I realized that tracking rates wasn't merely a mechanical necessity. It was a survival ritual that anchored perception and preserved the fragile connection between mind and environment. Every meter of vertical movement demanded acute attention, the instrument serving as an extension of my senses, a tether to reality. The momentary doubt was the depth gauge slightly off, or had my perception warped, made me aware of how thin the line was between control and disaster. I noticed the subtle interplay between ascent rates and shadows. When I adjusted slightly faster than planned, the darkness seemed to stretch, elongating forms along the trench walls, and I felt an instinctive urge to pause. Yet hesitation carried its own danger, slowing my rate and potentially violating the delicate equilibrium of buoyancy. My gloved hands moved methodically over controls, performing minor corrections to maintain precise velocities, and I realized that every shift, no matter how small, carried weight beyond comprehension. The trench amplified every action, and the shadows responded almost imperceptibly, testing whether my mental focus could hold under sustained pressure. Fatigue began to creep in, subtle at first, then insistent. My mind struggled to maintain consistent mental tracking while coordinating with instruments and environmental variables. I found myself recounting previous dives, mentally comparing rates, attempting to predict how minor adjustments could cascade into catastrophic outcomes. The act of calculation became meditative, but also oppressive. I noted each micro adjustment, ensuring that I didn't accelerate or decelerate too quickly, measuring my own reaction times against theoretical models in my head. Awareness of Rule 4 became both shield and cage, providing guidance while underscoring the impossibility of perfect control. As I approached a narrow canyon in the trench, the rate adjustments became more frequent, almost continuous, and the margin for error shrank to millimeters per second. I had to anticipate sudden changes in wall contour, subtle shifts in water density, and the possibility of unseen formations just outside the beam of light. Each adjustment was a negotiation between caution and necessity. I reminded myself that the smallest oversight could be irreversible, that a slight miscalculation might leave the submersible lodged impossibly against a rock face, the abyss pressing from all sides. My mind felt stretched thin, balancing calculation, environmental observation, and the pressure of isolation, each element amplifying the others. The shadows, now layered and complex, seemed to align with my micro-corrections, almost predicting the next adjustment. I realized the danger wasn't just mechanical or environmental, it was psychological. The constant vigilance required to track rates meticulously allowed no room for distraction, and the abyss seemed to feed on any lapse. I focused on breathing slowly, counting every breath, every adjustment, as if the rhythm of life depended on it. Even as I adhered to the rule, I could feel my mental state fraying, the trench demanding total attention while the shadows pressed against the edges of perception. Currents shifted unexpectedly, pushing the submersible slightly faster than planned, and my training kicked in reflexively, hands moving with precision over ballast and thrusters. I realized how delicate the balance was too fast, and the hull risked structural stress. Too slow, and environmental forces could create turbulence that destabilized control. I felt the weight of every meter, every millisecond of adjustment, embedding the lesson of Rule 4 deeply in my awareness. The shadows, almost imperceptible, flowed with the rhythm of the submersible, testing whether my focus would waver under sustained pressure. Hours into the descent, I noted that my mental calculations were becoming automatic, yet fatigue made errors more likely. I tracked the submersible's response to every micro-adjustment, noting deviations and countering them immediately. Each shadow seemed to move in concert with my corrections, and the trench felt alive, responsive to even the smallest variations. I realized that the rule wasn't about instruments alone. It was about maintaining a symbiotic awareness of machine environment and mind. One misstep could break the harmony and introduce consequences I couldn't yet predict, irreversible deviations that could leave me trapped, crushed, or disoriented. By the time I reached a particularly deep section where walls closed in and light barely penetrated, the tension of tracking rates was near unbearable. Every calculation had to be exact, my mind forced to operate with split-second precision while the shadows watched and mirrored, subtly, unnervingly. My hands were cramped from constant micro-adjustments, my brain exhausted from sustaining mental synchronization with instruments, currents, and environmental changes. Even the slightest lapse threatened to undo the meticulous balance of descent and ascent, a reminder that the Mariana Trench doesn't forgive negligence. I realized that Rule 4 was as much about preserving sanity as it was about controlling speed, a tether keeping my mind from being swallowed by the depth and the quiet, patient darkness surrounding me. I remember gripping the submersible's controls tightly as my eyes darted toward the trench wall, and I had to force myself to recall Rule 5. Never remove your eyes from a point of reference when shadows or unfamiliar movements are nearby. The shadows were thicker now, not tangible but present, sliding along surfaces in ways that didn't obey the patterns of light or physics. My gaze anchored to a jagged ridge that had become my mental tether, but the movement just beyond my peripheral vision made every muscle in my body tense. I could feel the water press against the hull differently whenever the shadows shifted, currents I couldn't measure, as if the trench itself were aware. The rule wasn't just instruction, it was survival. Even the slightest glance away, even a fleeting curiosity, seemed to make the presence pulse more intensely, testing the limits of my focus. I adjusted the lamps repeatedly to keep a steady illumination on my reference point, and yet the shadows responded in subtle ways, growing longer or shorter, distorting themselves along surfaces I couldn't reach. My mind tried to rationalize, telling me it was my exhaustion making things appear alive, but instinct screamed otherwise. Each movement, each flicker of shadow, demanded immediate attention. 1 second, I would be scanning a ridge. The next, the water would shimmer, as though the shadows had extended toward me, waiting for the tiniest lapse. I had to concentrate not just on sight, but on intuition, as if my mind's peripheral awareness could detect what my eyes were forbidden to confirm. Hours passed, or perhaps minutes. I had lost track, but the trench demanded vigilance. Every glance outside the fixed point was measured and deliberate. Even adjusting my focus required micro-steps that felt like a negotiation with something unseen. I realized that the rule was less about what was visible, and more about what acknowledging it did to my mind. Even knowing the shadows existed without directly seeing them could be destabilizing if my attention wandered. I found myself taking deliberate breaths, counting to 5 each time before scanning, using rhythm as a tool to maintain adherence while keeping the body relaxed enough to operate the submersible. The shadows tested this, edging closer with every micro-lapse in attention, yet I couldn't allow panic to break my focus. The trench itself seemed to encourage deception. Formations warped under the light, creating misleading shapes, and currents carried sediment in ways that mimicked movement. I had to ignore these distractions, keep my eyes locked on the anchor point, and resist the urge to investigate every flicker of motion. I realized that Rule 5 was as much about psychological endurance as physical survival. Every moment I obeyed it, my mind felt tethered, yet each second of disobedience threatened to unravel hours of mental stability. Shadows seemed patient, like predators testing prey, knowing I couldn't afford to look away without consequence. At one point, a small fissure along the ridge caught the submersible lights just right, creating the illusion of depth where there was none. My instincts wanted to examine it, reach toward it, or even move the vehicle slightly for a better view. I froze, reminded of Rule 5, and forced my gaze back to the stable ridge I had chosen as my anchor. The act of restraint became a full-body effort, a balancing of muscle memory, cognitive attention, and instinctive fear. Every second felt amplified, the shadows near my peripheral vision sliding, stretching, and testing my adherence. I could feel the trench itself responding to the tension, currents thickening, pressure fluctuating slightly against the hull. The longer I maintained focus, the more the shadows seemed to change subtly in response. They weren't chasing or overtly threatening. Instead, they tested, adapting their movement to mine, pushing at the limits of what my attention could handle. I realized the rule had multiple layers: physical observation, yes, but also mental discipline, the refusal to give in to instinctive curiosity. Each time my eyes wavered, I felt a psychological weight, a tension that pressed in from all sides, as if acknowledging the movement, even internally, would shift the environment. My hands tightened around controls, not from necessity, but from the anxiety of remaining compliant. Isolation made the rule harder to follow. No one could correct me, or even confirm what I was seeing. The trench amplified doubt. I began noticing patterns that weren't really there, tiny movements at angles that could have been optical illusions, but felt deliberate, almost sentient. The shadows moved with a rhythm that seemed to synchronize with my heartbeat, my respiration, my attention lapses. Every time I blinked, I felt the presence stretch closer, testing the line between awareness and acknowledgement. I had to enforce a mental discipline I'd never known before, to observe only the fixed reference, to resist curiosity, to survive through sheer self-control. At one point, a shadow stretched across the trench floor, long and serpentine, and I felt the almost irresistible urge to track it fully, with my eyes. My fingers twitched over the controls, almost reacting, almost violating the rule. I froze and forced myself to breathe, to re-anchor my gaze, reminding myself again of the subtle but deadly importance of Rule 5. The trench seemed to hum with a pressure I couldn't quantify, as though the abyss itself was enforcing adherence. The shadows didn't move in the way predators would. They were more patient, testing, coaxing, like a current of tension that pressed against my vision, my awareness, my willpower. The hours passed in cycles of micro-adjustments and mental recalibration. Every glance outside my anchor felt like a gamble, every flicker of movement a test of endurance. I realized that this rule was not about speed or mechanics, but about preserving a fragile mental state, an awareness tethered to a single constant in a world designed to unmoor perception. The shadows adapted, flowing just out of reach, subtly shaping themselves in response to any lapse. My mind stretched to accommodate vigilance, calculation, and survival simultaneously, and even as exhaustion gnawed at concentration, I couldn't allow my gaze to wander. By the time I reached a point where the trench widened slightly, allowing more options for reference points, I understood the rule's insidious weight. The shadows multiplied subtly, layers of movement appearing only when I wasn't directly watching them. Maintaining adherence to Rule 5 required more than attention. It required a commitment to resist instinct curiosity and exhaustion, to tether my awareness to a single immutable constant, while everything around me sought to dissolve it. Every adjustment of my gaze, every measured blink, became an act of survival, an assertion of control in an environment that sought to erode both body and mind with patient persistence. I remember the sudden flash of panic when a section of my submersible light flickered, and I instinctively reached for the controls, but I forced myself to pause and think about Rule 6. Never alter or tamper with your lighting or equipment without double-checking the environmental readings first. My heart thumped against the reinforced hull, and I could feel the water pressing in a way that made the moment almost unbearable. The shadows, long and fluid at the edges of my vision, seemed to notice my hesitation, stretching subtly along the contours of the trench, as if testing whether I would obey. I reminded myself that any impulse to fix or adjust without assessment could cascade into disaster, from miscalculating pressure differentials to inadvertently drawing attention to myself. Every second of restraint became a tether, a fragile thread connecting focus to survival. I carefully reviewed the environmental readings on the display panel, noting the minute shifts in pressure, temperature, and current. The flickering of the light wasn't random. The instruments suggested a localized fluctuation, subtle but measurable, and I realized that reacting too quickly could destabilize the delicate balance I had maintained for hours. My hands hovered over the control panel, resisting the urge to tweak the brightness or reorient the beam without full confirmation. The trench felt alive with anticipation, shadows stretching and contracting in ways I could only perceive in my peripheral vision. Even though the instruments didn't indicate immediate danger, my instincts screamed that any rash action could trigger unforeseen consequences that the Mariana Trench has a way of enforcing without mercy. Hours into the descent, I became acutely aware of how much the rule demanded patience. Each adjustment had to be deliberate, calculated, and verified against multiple readings. A slight increase in brightness might illuminate something helpful or reveal a shadow moving independently, breaking Rule 5. A minor shift in orientation could misalign my tether or send sediment cascading across the trench floor, creating disturbances that amplified psychological tension. The environment itself seemed to respond to any motion, currents subtly adjusting in reaction to the submersible. And I realized that Rule 6 was not just about preventing equipment failure. It was about maintaining harmony between human machine and the deep-sea ecosystem. I kept my focus on the environmental monitors, mentally scanning every column of data for anomalies. The shadows at the periphery seemed to linger longer when I hesitated, testing my adherence to the rule, pressing at the edges of my perception. I noticed tiny fluctuations in current that made the submersible sway imperceptibly, and I adjusted the ballast accordingly, ensuring that any motion was intentional and measured. The trench walls glistened unevenly under the beam, forming patterns that my mind wanted to interpret, to touch, or to alter, but the rule demanded strict compliance. My attention became a combination of instrument observation and peripheral vigilance, a constant exercise in self-control designed to prevent catastrophic error. Every flicker of light that wasn't accounted for caused my pulse to spike. I considered manually overriding the system, a reflex born from years of training, but I reminded myself of Rule 6 and forced my hands to rest, reassessing environmental data before taking action. The shadows seemed to react to the hesitation, curling along the contours of jagged rocks in ways that defied predictable physics. The trench felt almost sentient, as if aware of my adherence or lapses in discipline. My mental exhaustion compounded the physical strain of operating the submersible, making every decision more deliberate, more taxing. Each micro-adjustment became a negotiation between safety and instinct, requiring extreme focus to ensure compliance with the rule. The flicker returned sporadically, subtle enough that I could almost convince myself it was a hallucination, yet I knew better. I forced myself to cross-reference readings, power output stable, temperature stable, external currents within acceptable parameters. Only then did I cautiously adjust the orientation slightly, observing how shadows responded to the new angle. Even minimal movement created a ripple of tension, as if the trench itself was testing the boundaries of my obedience. I realized that the rule extended beyond physical safety. It was a psychological barrier against impulsive responses that the environment could exploit. My mind felt stretched across multiple dimensions of focus, balancing instrument readings, environmental awareness, and the subtle behaviors of the shadows. At one point, a section of the trench opened into a cavernous alcove, dark and vast, tempting me to increase the light output for a better view. My instincts screamed to illuminate, to explore, but I remembered Rule 6, forcing restraint. I checked environmental readings 3 times, adjusted microcontrols in slow succession, and allowed the shadows to remain partially obscured at the edges of perception. The delay was agonizing, Every second felt elongated, stretched by the awareness of consequence. Yet I survived the moment unscathed, the shadows receding slightly in response to measured behavior, reinforcing the necessity of strict adherence. The trench pressed closer as I moved deeper, the water darkening, and the shadows more persistent. Any impulsive adjustment could have catastrophic consequences, not just mechanical failure, but misalignment that could draw attention from entities or environmental phenomena beyond comprehension. I realized that Rule 6 was as much about preserving mental clarity as it was about maintaining operational integrity. Each action had to be deliberate, verified, and measured. My thoughts circled endlessly. One wrong adjustment, and the equilibrium I had painstakingly maintained could collapse, leaving me vulnerable to consequences I could neither predict nor control. I spent hours navigating with minimal adjustments, every flicker of light scrutinized, every shadowed corner measured against environmental data. The trench seemed aware of my caution, and the shadows responded with subtle elongations, lingering near my peripheral vision. I felt the crushing weight of responsibility, knowing that one impulsive move could undo hours of vigilance. The mental strain was immense, yet adherence to Rule 6 provided a small but critical thread of control in the chaos of the deep, a lifeline connecting observation, reaction, and restraint. Each breath was deliberate, each micro-adjustment a testament to discipline, and I realized that survival depended on total compliance with the rule. As I descended further, the shadows became more intricate, weaving patterns across jagged rock formations, sometimes appearing in pairs or clusters. Every time I considered adjusting lights or controls to get a better view, I had to consciously remember Rule 6, review the environmental data, and weigh the consequences. The trench seemed to press against every choice, every micro-decision carrying amplified significance. Even minor deviations in lighting or equipment manipulation could create cascading effects that I was powerless to reverse. The shadows, patient and watchful, seemed to understand this instinctively, testing boundaries without overtly attacking or revealing intent. By the time I reached an area with multiple overlapping fissures and small caverns, I understood the true weight of Rule 6. It wasn't simply about following procedure, it was about controlling the human impulse for curiosity, balancing instinct against consequence, and maintaining a tether to reason in a place designed to erode both. Every movement, every adjustment, every mental calculation became an exercise in restraint and survival. The trench, the shadows, the shifting currents, all responded in ways I could not predict, demanding compliance with the rule, as though the abyss itself enforced it. I remember the moment I hesitated at the edge of a yawning shadow. The light from the submersible, barely touching the jagged trench walls ahead, and I reminded myself of Rule 7. Always respect the boundaries of illuminated and non-illuminated zones, never crossing into darkness without calculated preparation. The darkness wasn't merely absence of light. It felt alive, dense, pressing against the submersible, shifting subtly with currents I couldn't measure. My hands gripped the controls as though trying to physically hold back the void, but I knew that restraint was not only mental, it was literal. Each inch forward into shadow without preparation could mean disorientation, unseen pressure anomalies, or provoking entities I wasn't ready to confront. The illuminated boundaries were my lifeline, the fragile edge between perceived safety and the unknowable that lay beyond. The trench seemed to pulse with subtle, almost imperceptible currents that bent shadows and flickered light along surfaces. I stayed within the circle of illumination, methodically scanning every crevice while planning my approach into darker zones. Even minor miscalculations could send the submersible drifting off course, exposing me to unseen dangers or creating a false sense of security. Shadows shifted just beyond my light, curling and stretching, as if sensing my intent to move. I realized Rule 7 was as much about mental control as mechanical caution. Stepping into darkness without preparation would erode more than spatial orientation. It could fracture confidence, leaving the mind vulnerable to panic and hallucination. Every decision to advance required, layered analysis, depth readings, current measurements, hull integrity checks, and shadow tracking. The non-illuminated areas held patterns my eyes couldn't discern, and each subtle shift of darkness made my pulse accelerate. I reminded myself that the rule wasn't arbitrary. It existed because even slight intrusion into unlit zones could displace water, disturb shadows, or provoke entities whose perception I couldn't predict. The trench seemed alive in response to hesitation, the shadows lingering near edges, almost curling around my illuminated zone, patient and patient, testing the line of adherence. My gloved fingers ached from gripping the controls, but moving too quickly into the darkness could undo all the precautions I had meticulously observed. I began to map the trench mentally, noting every ledge, fissure, and protrusion visible under the submersible lights, calculating which zones were safe to cross and which required additional caution. The shadows moved at the edge of perception, bending and stretching subtly, as if aware that my preparation was incomplete. I could almost feel them pressing against the invisible boundary of light, testing whether I would ignore Rule 7 and venture too far. Even with the lights, my mind strained to differentiate between solid forms and moving shadows, each step into preparation feeling like a negotiation with the abyss itself. The darkness was patient, but insistent, a quiet threat that required more than instinct to resist. Hours into the descent, I encountered a cavern that seemed to inhale the submersible's light, a black void extending beyond perception. The edges of illumination formed a fragile barrier. Crossing it recklessly would violate the rule and potentially invite disaster. I monitored instruments carefully, depth, orientation, currents, and any anomaly that might indicate structural shifts or pressure differentials. The shadows responded to my every micro-movement, extending toward the perimeter of light without crossing it, testing both my patience and adherence. My breathing slowed as I calibrated both lamp and thought, conscious of Rule 7 and the delicate balance between curiosity and compliance. One false step, one premature incursion into darkness, could destabilize everything I had worked to maintain. Even slight deviations in trajectory within the illuminated zones created tension. A minor adjustment could shift the submersible into deeper shadows, and the trench seemed to respond almost viscerally to these movements. I had to ensure every meter was pre-calculated, mentally rehearsing each maneuver, anticipating the effect on surrounding water and the invisible shapes moving beyond sight. The shadows lingered at the edges, waiting patiently, a reminder that the darkness was not merely absence but presence. Adhering to Rule 7 meant respecting these boundaries, acknowledging the unseen with caution, and allowing preparation to dictate movement rather than impulsive curiosity. The psychological strain increased with time. Isolation intensified the pressure, and the void beyond light seemed to stretch further with each passing minute. Even with the submersible safely operating, my mind strained to maintain vigilance, calculating the consequences of encroaching into unilluminated zones. Every flicker at the boundary demanded focus. Every subtle movement in the darkness required measured observation. I understood that Rule 7 functioned as both physical and mental safeguard, a structure imposed on chaos, ensuring that each step into the unknown was deliberate, supported, and survivable. Crossing the threshold recklessly would dissolve that structure instantly. As I progressed deeper, I noticed the shadows forming more complex patterns along the trench walls. Some elongated unnaturally, others seemed to mirror my own movements subtly. Even without directly entering darkness, my attention was consumed with analyzing potential hazards and maintaining control. The submersible lights formed a halo of order against a backdrop of creeping uncertainty, and Rule 7 dictated that I respect the invisible boundary, not just to avoid mechanical risk, but to maintain the fragile control over perception and focus. Any misstep could result in disorientation, loss of reference, or exposure to forces I couldn't predict. The trench seemed to breathe around me, subtle currents tugging at the submersible in rhythm with my heartbeat. Shadows shifted imperceptibly, as if marking boundaries I hadn't yet noted, testing whether my attention would falter. Each potential incursion into darkness was analyzed, cross-referenced with environmental data, and only approached when all variables aligned. The patience required was exhausting. My muscles stiffened from prolonged tension, my mind worn thin by constant vigilance. Still, I maintained the rule, aware that Rule 7 was the difference between safe navigation and drifting unmoored into psychological and physical peril. By the time I reached a section where multiple dark crevices intersected, the challenge of the rule became fully apparent. I had to mentally partition the illuminated zone from the deep shadow, measure every micro-adjustment of submersible position, and resist the instinctive urge to illuminate, to see, to touch what was hidden. Shadows reacted to every micro-movement, curling and stretching toward the light without crossing it, waiting for any violation. The trench seemed to whisper through pressure changes and subtle currents that readiness was everything. I realized then that Rule 7 was not merely about physical illumination. It was about the discipline to respect boundaries in a space designed to dissolve control, sanity, and orientation in equal measure. I remember the chill crawling along my spine when I first realized that Rule 8, never underestimate the persistence of shadows, as they can track your presence and intentions even without direct visibility, wasn't just a precaution. It was a law enforced by the trench itself. I had paused near an overhang to adjust the submersible's sensors, thinking the shadows were just anomalies of light. But the subtle movement at the edges of perception told a different story. They didn't advance like predators. They lingered, patient, stretching and contracting with every small adjustment I made, almost as if aware of my intentions before I acted. My mind spun with calculations and caution, knowing that even a single lapse could mean the difference between controlled navigation and triggering consequences that would ripple far beyond comprehension. Hours passed as I moved cautiously, the shadows trailing in silent, fluid persistence. Every change in submersible orientation, every flicker of light, seemed to provoke a reaction. They didn't respond immediately. Instead, they mirrored, anticipated, or stretched subtly in alignment with my focus. I could feel a psychological weight pressing against the hull and my thoughts, a constant reminder that Rule 8 was about more than physical vigilance. It was about recognizing the deep, patient intelligence of the environment. Even when I diverted my attention for instrumentation checks or environmental readings, I sensed them following, tracking, measuring, testing whether I would falter or miscalculate. I began to notice patterns that were both terrifying and fascinating. Shadows seemed to linger longer in areas where I hesitated, almost teasing the edge of my attention. When I corrected minor course deviations, they adjusted accordingly, and sometimes, I could swear their form twisted with purpose, curling in the water as if to mark my presence. Each observation reinforced the importance of Rule 8, teaching me that persistence wasn't simply about being present. It was about influence, anticipation, and mental endurance. I understood that the shadow's patience was as formidable as any predator. It was a quiet, enduring test of my adherence to discipline and control. The trench itself became a collaborator in this subtle game. Currents shifted in response to my movement, carrying sediment that warped the edges of shadows, creating forms that seemed almost sentient. My instruments confirmed nothing unusual, yet my perception screamed differently. The longer I operated under these conditions, the more I realized that Rule 8 demanded constant awareness, even when nothing appeared to be threatening. The shadows were a silent pressure, observing my reactions, my hesitation, my micro-adjustments, and I understood that acknowledging them, even mentally, without maintaining proper distance and adherence to protocol, could provoke unforeseen consequences. Every movement became deliberate, each adjustment a negotiation with both the submersible and the unseen presence beyond the light. The shadows didn't attack, but they didn't need to. Their persistence created tension, psychological erosion, and uncertainty, all of which could undermine my judgment in critical moments. I noted micro-fluctuations along the trench walls, subtle changes in density and flow, almost as if the environment itself reinforced the rule, embedding it deeper into consciousness. Rule 8 became a meditation of restraint, patience, and observation, a necessary discipline to prevent the persistent shadows from exploiting lapses in focus. The deeper I descended, the more complex the shadow's behavior became. Some elongated along ridges, others coalesced into shapes I couldn't define, yet all followed my general trajectory with patient precision. Even turning my head slightly away made me feel their subtle attention, a mental echo of presence that made the trench feel alive in ways I hadn't fully grasped before. I realized that persistence here wasn't just movement, it was an intelligence, a quiet, enduring pressure that demanded constant respect and vigilance. Ignoring Rule 8 even momentarily risked not just physical danger, but mental destabilization, a collapse of the careful structure I had painstakingly maintained. At one point, I noticed a shadow elongating beneath the submersible, almost imperceptibly reacting to my movements, before I had a chance to consider them. The instinct to adjust the vehicle, to reposition, rose immediately, but I forced restraint, remembering Rule 8. I recalibrated, slowed my movements, and allowed the submersible to drift gently within the current, observing how the persistent darkness responded. It was a subtle, nerve-wracking lesson in patience. Persistence wasn't a threat I could fight with speed or aggression. It was a constant, patient test of endurance, calculation, and mental stability. Hours turned into what felt like days, each interval marked by micro-adjustments and careful monitoring of environmental cues. Shadows lingered, following, mirroring, occasionally coalescing into forms that suggested intent without ever directly revealing it. My mind strained to remain disciplined, to acknowledge the persistence without panicking, to adjust only when absolutely necessary. I understood that Rule 8 demanded more than compliance. It required anticipation, awareness, and a recognition of patterns I could barely quantify, all while navigating the trench's oppressive isolation. As I moved through a narrow passage where walls pressed close, the shadows became more layered, overlapping in a way that made each observation taxing. Any sudden shift in submersible position could provoke a reaction I couldn't predict. I slowed every maneuver, monitored current and pressure changes, and relied on training to maintain control. The shadows moved independently, yet with alignment to my trajectory, a subtle intelligence that made me reconsider every assumption. The rule became a mantra. Persistence was not an enemy to evade, but a force to respect, a constant reminder that the trench demanded patience, observation, and careful restraint. By the time I reached a section with multiple overhangs and deep crevices, the subtle persistence of the shadows had become nearly overwhelming. They twisted around the terrain, following my submersible's path without deviation, their silent pressure pressing on both hull and mind. Even when I didn't look, I could feel them adjusting to my presence, anticipating intentions, testing boundaries. My focus was absolute. Every movement, every instrument check, every breath was deliberate, a negotiation between survival and psychological endurance. Rule 8 had embedded itself in every calculation, every cautious adjustment, every measured decision. The shadow's patient tracking made it clear that adherence wasn't optional. The persistence of the unknown was a force that demanded respect, control, and unwavering vigilance. I remember the icy tension settling in my chest the moment I considered sending a brief status update, and I reminded myself of Rule 9. Never attempt communication or signal beyond the submersible, unless you are certain of what is receiving your message. The Mariana Trench doesn't forgive curiosity, and every unverified signal could reach far beyond human comprehension, drawing attention from entities or forces I could neither see nor anticipate. My instruments were stable, communications protocols ready, but the thought of transmitting without certainty felt like opening a door I couldn't close. Shadows shifted subtly in response to the flicker of my lights, as if sensing the potential breach of protocol, testing whether I would obey. I realized that even the desire to check in, to assert control or seek reassurance, could trigger consequences I wasn't prepared to endure. As I hovered near a narrow trench ridge, the urge to communicate crept in, subtle and insistent. My mind raced, weighing the risks. A brief signal might confirm the submersible's position, but what if something else, something unseen, intercepted it? I ran the mental checklist again, each verification a struggle against fatigue and instinct. Rule 9 wasn't just about sending messages. It was about restraint, discipline, and recognition that the abyss doesn't respond predictably to human interaction. Shadows, patient and deliberate, lingered just at the edge of perception, elongating and shifting as if sensing my wavering attention. The rule became an anchor, a mental tether preventing impulsive actions that could irreversibly compromise safety. Hours of tension followed, the submersible moving cautiously through jagged terrain, while I monitored every instrument. My hands hovered over communication panels repeatedly, resisting the primal urge to send a signal, a reassurance, or even a test pulse. The shadows moved subtly in the corners of light, almost in rhythm with my internal struggle, stretching toward the edges of perception, testing discipline. Even when no movement could be perceived, the awareness that anything sent could be tracked, mirrored, or responded to by unknown forces weighed heavily. I realized Rule 9 demanded more than mechanical compliance. It required psychological endurance, the ability to resist action that instinct might tell me was harmless. The trench's walls seemed to close in slightly as I moved deeper, creating pressure zones that magnified even minor emotional reactions. The urge to confirm my position or communicate with distant stations became unbearable at times. Yet I forced restraint, reminding myself of the subtle consequences outlined by the rule. Shadows shifted as I focused on readings, lingering near areas that were illuminated while avoiding direct detection, testing my compliance. Even the smallest adjustment of controls, if coupled with an impulsive signal, could set off interactions I would be powerless to reverse. The rule became a silent mantra, a guiding principle to maintain both physical safety and mental coherence. I recall a moment when a faint anomaly appeared on the sonar feed, a pattern that almost suggested another presence in the trench. My first impulse was to transmit, to inquire, to assert a connection, but Rule 9 held me back. Instead, I observed, measured, and recalibrated the submersible's position to maintain safety. The shadows seemed to react subtly, adjusting along walls and crevices, reflecting a patient intelligence testing my adherence. Every hesitation, every measured breath, was an exercise in restraint and observation, reinforcing the critical nature of the rule. In that moment, I understood that communication without certainty wasn't just risky. It was reckless in a way that the Mariana Trench enforces with quiet, patient consequences. As the descent continued, I noticed micro-fluctuations in environmental readings that could easily be interpreted as potential signals or interference. The temptation to probe or respond was constant, yet I adhered strictly to Rule 9, cross-referencing every anomaly against instruments before taking any action. Shadows shifted in response to subtle changes in light, movement, or environmental disturbances, further underscoring the danger of impulsive communication. My mental state strained under the tension of constant monitoring, awareness, and restraint, as the abyss pressed against the submersible, patient and silent, a living force observing every decision. The longer I operated in these conditions, the more I recognized how communication, or even the thought of it, could destabilize not just position, but mental stability. The shadows seemed to mirror intent, curling toward any perceived deviation, and even idle thoughts of signaling created an almost tangible pressure against cognition. Rule 9 required me to maintain absolute certainty before attempting any transmission, embedding mental discipline alongside operational protocol. It became apparent that sending a signal without this assurance could have cascading consequences, not just physically, but psychologically, as the trench's patient, watchful environment exacted its cost. I continued navigating through narrow passages and deep crevices, shadows layering along the walls and floor in patterns that constantly shifted. Even a brief glance at the communication panel had to be measured, deliberate, assessed for risk, and double-checked against environmental data. Every impulse to reach out externally demanded verification, resisting instinct, and maintaining strict focus on operational safety. I realized that Rule 9 was a complex blend of technical adherence, psychological discipline, and awareness of the trench's unpredictable intelligence. Compliance was not optional, it was survival. By the time I reached a cavern that seemed to swallow the submersible's lights almost entirely, the rule's weight became undeniable. The shadows were layered and persistent, stretching across surfaces in ways that felt sentient. Even the smallest micro-adjustment could provoke subtle shifts in current, sediment, or perception, making the thought of external communication more dangerous than ever. I understood that restraint was my only safeguard, that maintaining control of information, what was seen, measured, or transmitted, was as critical as controlling the vehicle itself. The trench demanded vigilance, patience, and adherence to Rule 9, a rule that preserved both safety and mental integrity in a space designed to unmoor perception. Hours later, my mind teetered on the edge of fatigue, but I maintained control, scanning every shadow, monitoring every fluctuation, and resisting the urge to send a single unverified signal. The submersible responded flawlessly to micro-adjustments, yet the darkness beyond and the persistent shadows remained a patient reminder of the rule's importance. Every glance, every breath, every adjustment was executed under the constant mental presence of Rule 9, reinforcing its critical role in surviving the trench's oppressive isolation and testing patience. I realized that the abyss itself would exploit any lapse, and only strict adherence allowed a fragile thread of stability to persist amidst the weight of uncertainty. I remember the sudden jolt of panic when the submersible tilted unexpectedly, and I reminded myself of Rule 10. Never assume the trench behaves predictably, as its currents, pressures, and shadows can change without warning. For hours, I had been navigating a relatively calm section, the shadows curling predictably along jagged walls, currents flowing in subtle but measurable patterns. Then, without indication on any instrument, the submersible shuddered as if an invisible hand had pressed against it, and I realized how dangerously deceptive the trench could be. My mind raced to analyze readings, to reconcile the instruments with what my body felt. But even the most meticulous data couldn't prepare me for the sudden shift. The shadows lengthened, stretched and twisted with a patience that suggested they understood every miscalculation I could make. I adjusted the ballast quickly but carefully, fighting the urge to overcorrect, knowing that Rule 10 demanded recognition of the trench's unpredictability rather than reactionary panic. Every second, every micro-adjustment mattered. One misjudgment could send the submersible spinning, damaging the hull or disorienting me in ways that became impossible to recover from. The shadows, silent observers at the periphery of vision, seemed to stretch further with every tremor, measuring my control, testing my adherence to discipline. Even when instruments suggested stability, the sensations of the trench betrayed the lie of predictability. I understood then that the rule was as much about mental flexibility as operational precision. The deeper I descended, the more subtle the environmental changes became. Currents twisted unpredictably, eddies appearing and vanishing without warning. Pressure readings fluctuated in ways that defied normal understanding, tiny micro-shifts that could compromise structural integrity over minutes if unnoticed. Shadows moved with a deceptive rhythm, sometimes lagging, sometimes anticipating, reinforcing the notion that nothing here was constant. I reminded myself repeatedly of Rule 10, knowing that the assumption of predictability could erode both survival and sanity. Each observation, each adjustment, required acute awareness, mental stamina, and an acceptance of uncertainty. Hours passed in this tense state of vigilance. Even the smallest deviation in course required immediate recognition and calibrated response, but without panic. I had to rely on intuition shaped by countless hours of experience and training, balancing instrument readings against environmental sensation. Shadows reacted to micro-movements of the submersible, as if aware of my mental hesitation, shifting in ways that made it impossible to distinguish between environmental fluctuation and deliberate action. The unpredictability of the trench was a constant test, one that punished assumptions and rewarded patience, observation, and disciplined adherence to the rule. At one point, a section of the trench narrowed, the walls pressing close and currents twisted unexpectedly, throwing a small swirl of sediment across the beam of the lights. My initial instinct was to overcompensate, to adjust speed and ballast aggressively, but I forced restraint, recalling Rule 10. The shadows reacted subtly, curling along walls and extending toward the submersible, as if marking the consequence of hesitation or overreaction. I realized that each movement had to be premeditated, measured not only against instruments, but against the unpredictable rhythm of the trench itself. My body tensed as I made micro-adjustments. Every nerve alert, every thought focused on both visible and imperceptible elements of the environment. Fatigue began to gnaw at my concentration, and I recognized how quickly the assumption of predictability could erode mental clarity. Shadows became more layered, subtle shifts in water pressure and current, increasing the complexity of each decision. Even when readings suggested stability, the trench continued to behave in ways that challenged perception and intuition. Rule 10 reminded me that absolute reliance on predictability was fatal. Only flexibility, patience, and constant observation could sustain both physical and mental stability. Every decision, from minor adjustments to calculated navigation, was amplified by the trench's unpredictable nature, leaving no room for error or complacency. I navigated through a narrow canyon, where currents shifted suddenly and inexplicably, and the shadows elongated across the jagged walls. The submersible tilted slightly, and I felt the pressure against the hull intensify in ways that were impossible to quantify. The irregular movement was a stark reminder of Rule 10, reinforcing that every assumption about safety, flow, or shadow behavior could be fatal. My hands hovered over controls, adjusting ballast in millimeters, calculating micro-corrections, while the shadows responded to each motion with a quiet, patient intelligence. The unpredictability of the trench transformed even mundane navigation into a high-stakes negotiation between mind, machine, and abyss. Time lost its meaning in these conditions. The shadows, currents, and pressure shifts seemed to operate on a rhythm independent of my perception, testing my adherence to Rule 10 at every turn. Even slight miscalculations amplified through the trench's unpredictable environment could become catastrophic over minutes. I measured every movement, calculated every adjustment, and resisted the impulse to overreact to perceived threats. The mental strain was immense. Every observation required focus, and every micro-decision carried amplified consequence. The abyss rewarded careful observation and punished assumptions, leaving no margin for error. By the time I reached a wider section, the trench seemed almost sentient, reacting subtly to my trajectory and adjustments. Shadows flowed and stretched in response to minor course corrections, currents twisted without warning, and pressure zones fluctuated unpredictably. I realized the full weight of Rule 10. Survival required accepting uncertainty as a constant companion, maintaining disciplined observation, and never assuming that patterns observed moments ago would persist. The trench itself was a force beyond calculation, a patient, testing presence that demanded unwavering adherence to awareness and flexibility in every maneuver. The deeper into the abyss I traveled, the more apparent the consequences of neglecting Rule 10 became. Even minor assumptions about stability could amplify into chaos, disorientation, or subtle structural strain. The shadows and currents seemed to respond almost sentiently to deviations, emphasizing that unpredictability was not just environmental but psychological, a constant erosion of certainty. Each micro-adjustment, measured response, and observed behavior reinforced the necessity of the rule. The trench was an environment designed to punish complacency, and the only safeguard was respect for its unpredictability, a recognition that survival required both mental and operational agility under unrelenting pressure. I remember the cold dread tightening around my chest as I first fully understood Rule 11. Never assume you are alone, because the trench can harbor presences that observe, follow, and anticipate your every action. For hours, I had convinced myself that shadows were merely products of light and terrain, yet subtle disturbances in water pressure, minute currents that had no visible source, and shifts in the very feel of the trench told me otherwise. Something was there, always there, watching from beyond sight, and the longer I traveled, the more certain I became that these presences didn't need visibility to influence the environment. My hands shook slightly as I adjusted the submersible's ballast, forcing myself to remember that caution and awareness were my only defenses. Every instinct screamed to look, to act, yet Rule 11 demanded restraint. The deeper I descended, the more tangible the sense of being followed became. Microcurrents would tug at the submersible, subtle enough that instruments read nothing significant, yet impossible to ignore. Shadows, already persistent from earlier rules, now seemed to multiply, layering across walls and floor, moving with an uncanny rhythm in tandem with my trajectory. I realized that even when the trench appeared empty, the presences were embedded within its very fabric, tracking, responding, anticipating. The isolation wasn't emptiness. It was a calculated observation, a silent pressure that made every decision carry weight beyond comprehension. Following Rule 11 meant maintaining focus while acknowledging forces that could never be seen or fully measured. Hours blurred into an indistinct continuum as I navigated narrow fissures and cavernous depressions. Every light adjustment, every micro-turn of the submersible's orientation seemed to provoke subtle responses from the unseen. Currents shifted unpredictably, sediment spiraled into delicate patterns, and shadows stretched toward me in ways that no human could intentionally manipulate. Rule 11 reminded me that I was never alone, even when instruments' light and perception suggested solitude. The awareness of constant observation made every micro-decision critical. One miscalculated maneuver could draw attention or provoke forces I could neither predict nor control. The trench was patient, almost intelligent, and I felt its gaze pressing at me through water, pressure, and shadows alike. I recall the moment a sudden flicker of light reflected off the trench wall in a pattern that didn't correspond to the submersible's beam. My immediate thought was anomaly, equipment malfunction, or my own fatigue, yet a deeper instinct screamed that something was tracking, waiting, watching. I froze, resisting the urge to scan or signal, and reminded myself of Rule 11. Even acknowledging the presence mentally could provoke subtle consequences. The shadows and currents seemed to sense my hesitation. The abyss itself became a participant in my survival, a silent, patient observer that demanded every ounce of discipline, anticipation, and calculation. As I moved into a wider section, the sensation intensified. Shadows at the periphery seemed to follow, not erratically, but with calculated patience, curling along walls, stretching across fissures, almost communicating through subtle shifts in form. Currents responded to my movements, as if choreographed in real time with unseen observers. I realized Rule 11 extended beyond physical threat. It was a psychological imposition, a constant low-level erosion of confidence and perception. The submersible, the instruments, and even my senses became part of a system of observation, where every blink, every adjustment, and every breath could be monitored by presences I could neither confront nor fully perceive. The next hours were spent in extreme vigilance. I adjusted micro-thrusters with painstaking precision, monitored every current and pressure fluctuation, and resisted the primal urge to signal or investigate. Shadows extended, contracted, and multiplied in ways that suggested awareness of my strategies, my hesitations, and my corrections. Even when I forced myself to look away, the sensation of being followed persisted, embedded in water pressure, in currents, in the subtle pulse of light reflecting off cavern walls. Rule 11 became an anchor, a constant reminder that acknowledgement of the unseen was necessary, but engagement could be fatal. Survival required awareness without provocation, observation without overreaction, and an unflinching respect for presence beyond visibility. Fatigue compounded the tension. Hours of monitoring, micro-adjustments, and restrained observation stretched my mental endurance to the limit. Every muscle ached, every synapse strained to process minute shifts in shadow, pressure, or current. I noticed patterns in the behavior of the unseen, subtle cues that suggested intelligence and patience, micro changes in shadow length, corresponding with micro adjustments of the submersible, currents swirling slightly in tandem with my movements. The trench itself was alive with observation, a participant in the survival calculus. Adhering to Rule 11 was no longer just about caution, it was about maintaining sanity and control in a domain that sought to unmoor both. The presences seemed to intensify near fissures where the submersible's light struggled to reach. Shadows coalesced into shapes that suggested movement, flowing along walls with a rhythm independent of any current. I forced myself to focus on instruments, on readings, on environmental data, yet awareness of Rule 11 made every microsecond heavy with tension. I realized that the trench was not simply a physical environment, but a psychological maze, where every decision, every adjustment, and every observation could be anticipated by entities whose reach extended beyond visibility. Compliance with the rule became a survival mechanism, a tether anchoring me to control in the midst of omnipresent silent observation. At one point, the submersible drifted into an alcove where shadows layered in complex formations, almost resembling figures frozen mid-motion. My instinct screamed to investigate, to document, to respond, yet I reminded myself of Rule 11. Any attempt at engagement without certainty of observation could provoke reactions I wasn't equipped to handle. Currents shifted subtly, sediment spiraled into micro-eddies, and shadows adjusted along surfaces with uncanny timing. The presence of the unseen was undeniable, but its patience was equally so. Every micro-decision required consideration of observation, intention, and consequence, transforming simple navigation into a sustained exercise in psychological endurance. The deeper I descended, the more pronounced the feeling of being watched became. Shadows, currents, and subtle pressure fluctuations moved with a synchronicity that defied explanation. Even minor changes in trajectory elicited anticipatory responses, as if the trench itself were an intelligent entity monitoring my adherence to rules, particularly Rule 11. I understood then that survival was not merely about controlling the submersible or obeying previous rules. It was about maintaining discipline in the presence of the unseen, never assuming safety, never assuming solitude, and never acting without anticipation of consequence. Hours later, as the trench walls narrowed and the submersible floated in a dark, cavernous expanse, the silent presence became undeniable. I could feel the weight of observation in every shift of water, every elongation of shadow, every microcurrent adjusting subtly around me. Compliance with Rule 11 required vigilance, patience, and a constant awareness that I was never truly alone, even when the instruments suggested isolation. Every breath, every adjustment, every calculation was influenced by the unyielding awareness of observation beyond visibility. The trench had become not just a space of navigation, but a domain of endurance, obedience, and psychological survival. If you enjoyed this story, like, share, and subscribe for more.